everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Professor Paul Quinn. I'm a researcher at the VUB at LSCS. My background is primarily privacy and data protection. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to our panel on cybersecurity and AI. And we hope you're going to enjoy it because we have an interesting range of speakers. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague Olga because she played the biggest part in organizing this panel. And though I'm speaking before you, she deserves much of the credit. And also for organizing this interesting panel. I welcome you all today. Just a bit about myself. Why am I interested in this subject? Well, we are involved in a lot of EU projects as a legal and ethical partner. And we often have to opine on the applicability of various data protection frameworks and other legal frameworks. And we're involved in a number of cybersecurity projects, both of which are with Dimitris. He will speak about one shortly, the cybersecurity project. But we're also involved in a project called LOCARD, and both involve elements of cybersecurity. And I can honestly say, from a legal perspective, none are so challenging as these sorts of projects, because with every aspect of data protection, they present, quite a big puzzle. All the basic elements are challenging. We really have to put our thinking caps on. It's not just a question of simple compliance, but we really have to try and discern how do basic legal requirements apply in these contexts. For example, where are data anonymous, where they are not? What kind of legal basis should apply? How is it possible to facilitate data subject rights? And then when you bring AI into the picture, things get even more complex. And we know that the GDPR seeks to restrict AI to certain contexts or how it is used, especially where we're talking about sensitive data, which may often be the case in the cybersecurity context, especially because we're working with IoT and big forms of data. And as we know, the bigger the data, the bigger the pool, the more likely it is to A, be personal data, and B, be sensitive data, which is problematic for us. Anyway, that's enough about me and why I'm interested in this topic. I don't want to talk for too long because this discussion is likely to be complex and I don't want to eat into the time of our panelists. So I will proceed to the first speaker, Dimitris Kavallieros. Apologies for the pronunciation. I just practiced the pronunciation, but I've already messed it up. Apologies. He is a research associate at the Center for Security Studies at the Hellenic Ministry of Citizen Protection. And he is the coordinator of the Cybersecurity project, of which we are a partner. And so it's my pleasure to give the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Paul. Olga, it is a pleasure and honor for inviting me and be present in this conference. The main part of the presentation will be in general about artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. And then we will demonstrate we'll showcase how Cybertrust is using AI for cybersecurity and safeguarding people. The main topics, as I said, is the timeline to show how it started and the current progress of artificial intelligence, AI techniques, AI and cybersecurity, and the Cybertrust paradigm. So basically, until the late 40s, artificial intelligence was science fiction, movies, discussion, and fun. While at the late 40s, the first computer capable of storing commands developed, and then things start turning differently and discussing and working on the artificial intelligence side of science. In 50s, the first paper regarding artificial intelligence with the main question, can machines think, was presented. Then the first program, the logic theorist, was developed, which was able to mimic the problem-solving skills of humans, and was developed by Research and Development Corporation, and the first conference on AI took place. After that, the US government, alongside with DARPA, started funding artificial intelligence area, let's say, and ELISA, it's an early NLP natural language process, was developed. Then in 60s, they identified that we have some issues like computational power. We do not have enough computational and storage power in order to be able to run the commands and the training needed in order to move forward with the artificial intelligence. So the funding stopped, and the era of AI winter, as it's called, started for at least 10 to 15 years. Then in the 70s, new machine learning algorithms started to be appeared and developed, and then the expert system introduction, commercialization, and the reappearance of neural networks. That happened mid to end 70s until late 80s. And then at the 90s, we have the Deep Blue, as you'll remember, defeats Kasparov in a chess match. The first speech recognition software is implemented in Windows, and intelligent agents start appearing. Then we have a bloom of artificial intelligence, and the funding starts running again from 2000 onwards up until now. So we have the reservoir computing, then the appearance of deep learning, then the Siri as a speech assistant. Then we have the supercomputer Watson, which wins the game Jeopardy. Then the appearance of Alexa. A few years ago, the AlphaGo of Google wins the world champions in the game Go. We are continuing after that with driverless cars, and after that we have the establishment of ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and now we are reaching 2020. The funding is much bigger, and we'll discuss it a little bit later. After that, we have some of the techniques employed for artificial intelligence is the machine learning, which includes deep learning, natural language process, which basically provides what we need for text generation, machine translation, and classification. It's highly used, especially in platforms and tools employed at the moment from law enforcement agents to identify text needed in the web. Then we have the speech recognition techniques, speech-to-text translation, text-to-speech translation, and goes on. We have the area of vision, which is machine vision, image recognition, video analysis, and goes on, and some other things like robotics that they are not present in this presentation because we are focused in the cybersecurity domain. All these techniques are highly used in cybersecurity and in tools developed to fight against cybercrime. Some of the tools developed at the moment in order to fight and assist cybersecurity and fight cybercrime is intrusion detection systems. All of them are using AI techniques at the moment, and they are expanding and developing even further and further day by day. Intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, and automated mitigation techniques and algorithms. Automated network analysis techniques and algorithms, behavior analysis and anomaly detection, and of course, something that is more or less, let's say, new, and many big companies are investing at the moment, self-healing programs. They want to make it in a position, let's say, at some point to be able to identify bugs and issues in the code and start healing itself to avoid any attacks. Sorry. As we said before, the fund started running again, and now Europe is planning to invest for the next decade around 20 billion euros per year in all research areas, not only about cybersecurity, agriculture, automation, transportation, health, everywhere, in all areas, about 20 billion euros. As you can understand, as it's a huge number, the investment, as they have analyzed it, the profit after that most likely will be very beneficial for the citizens of Europe. And as we said before, this Cybertrust project, which organized the panel, employed AI techniques in few of the modules developed at the moment in order to safeguard smart homes and citizens and IoT ecosystems against sophisticated attacks like DDoS, hijacking, malware spreading, and goes on. One of these modules is the Intelligent Intrusion Response System, which is capable to automated response and minimize against sophisticated attack in a smart home environment or a cellular network, and at the same time minimize the impact against IoT devices. It will be possible to detect the attack, response, mitigate it, based on predefined, let's say, indicators in order to minimize the impact against our smart home. The next module is the Cyber Defense Service module, which is able to protect hardware and software configuration of IoT devices, assess the vulnerabilities of the devices, and propose remediation actions, verify the behavior of the IoT device against security policies, ensure the trustworthiness of the IoT operation, increase the resistance against DDoS attacks, and this will be demonstrated in a visualization environment in 2D, and we will try to do it as best possible in 3D environment in order to be faster to identify the attacks. And the last module I would like to speak is the Network Asset Repository, which is basically be able to identify the network assets, then do a vulnerability assessment, identify vulnerabilities that might put the whole network in risk, and in collaboration with the Intelligent Intrusion Response System, we'll be able to verify the behavior based on the applications running, on the firmware, as the firmware, the company that created the firmware and the software has provided this information, and and that way we'll be able to identify if a breach or a dummy firmware has been installed. And this is a part of the Cybertrust platform and how it's planning to mitigate against cyber attacks in IoT ecosystems. I hope I was in the time frame. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yep, thank you, Dimitris. You're actually a minute under, which is a rare thing in this, in this environment. Our next speaker is Carolin Möller. She works at Deloitte in the Berlin office. She supports national and European authorities in identifying policy challenges and designing policy solutions. Her thematic focus lies in data protection, cybersecurity, privacy, AI, and ethics.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this panel, both to you and to Olga, and also for inviting me. So I'm really happy to be part of this really interesting debate. As already mentioned, my focus today is on talking about the advantages, but also mainly the challenges of using AI in the cybersecurity context with respect to data protection. I will, can I have this? Yes, thank you. I will mainly structure this presentation around four main things. So first of all, I want to also mention a couple of words of why actually AI is relevant for cybersecurity. Then I will, building on what Dimitris has said, talk a bit about how AI is actually used right now and what the future fields could be. And then I will focus more on the data protection side of things before drawing some conclusions. So to start with, I have identified mainly three aspects why I think AI is actually relevant for cybersecurity. So first of all, there are loads and loads of statistics that talk about the increase of security breaches. So for example, one study has argued that since 2018, the breaches have increased by 11%. There are also some statistics that talk about the size of the cybersecurity market, and according to Gartner, I think it's reaching 135 billion by 2022. So this just shows the massive implications that cybersecurity has on all sorts of organizations. The second aspect is that cyber threats are continuously changing. So one aspect is that the connectivity is changing, specifically in relation to IoT. There is a lot that is happening, so there are more entry points where cyber criminals can attack systems. There's also, of course, AI, which is used by cyber criminals, so that also needs to be taken into account. And then obviously the nature of the attacks are constantly changing, so there AI can obviously also have a huge impact. And then last but not least, also we're facing actually a labor shortage in relation to cybersecurity. So right now the unemployment rate is at 0%, and by the end of last year there was actually more than 1.5 million jobs opening globally. So that's also, AI can of course also help to deal with this labor shortage that we experience. So then going on, how is AI actually used for cybersecurity purposes? So Dimitris has already provided a more technical and in-depth analysis on this, but maybe just to reshuffle a bit how one can also kind of structure this, I have decided to look into what is actually, how AI can be used before a threat is happening, so in the larger context. So there, I think there is relevant to mention that AI can be used for cyber intelligence, so going through web article blogs, the wider aspects and analysis that are done in the field to look actually what is happening, and then use this analysis to give to the cybersecurity analysts. Then the second is actually what can we do in an organizational context, and I think there the profile the focus is much on risk profiling. So how can, for example, behavior analysis help to understand where, for example, the threats lie? And then the last aspect is actually when an incident happens. So what actually can AI contribute once an incident has taken place? And there I think self-healing was mentioned by you before. So of course all of these solutions that have been mentioned before can be categorized also of the before and what has actually happened after an attack has taken place. So now looking into more the data protection implications. So first of all, I think it is interesting to look into what actually groups of people are potentially concerned by AI solutions. And I think there we can mention four categories. So one is relation to the intelligence aspect, where actually data from a wider community can actually be used by AI solutions. Second aspect, especially if you look into risk assessments in an organizational context, there could, for example, be data from employees could be included in an AI solution. And then also when we look specifically at an IoT environment, data from customers could be also used by AI. And then last but not least, also data of suspect could potentially be leveraged on by AI solutions. Also, I mean, first to maybe just say a couple of words also of what type of data can be used. I guess there would be core data like names, email addresses, IP addresses, but potentially, especially if we look into the aspect of customer data, when specific behavioral analysis are made, there could potentially be also sensitive data that is actually leveraged on by AI solutions. So if we then go on, what are actually the implications on specific aspects of data protection? So of course, one has to look into the different aspects that could be potentially impacted on, and I have just picked up on a few of them. Of course, that list is not exclusive, but I think potentially with consent and transparency, that could definitely be an issue, because consent has to be, of course, specific and informed, especially if we're not knowing really what AI is doing with the data. That could be a problem. Then there is, of course, an issue with profiling, which is mentioned in Article 22 of the GDPR, and that, of course, could play a role if there is sensitive data of customers used by AI solutions. And then I think, like in all other AI aspects, data minimization and the right to be forgotten are also aspects that are quite difficult to comply with any type of AI solution. So this, just to give an overview of potential risks. Then what actually can be done to mitigate those risks? And I think there we can focus on the one hand on organizational measures. So those organizations that are using AI for cybersecurity purposes have, of course, to be educated. There has to be awareness raising. There has to be monitoring and oversight. And I think also the organizational aspects of how to ensure data subject rights is also important to mention here. And then, of course, there are also technical measures that can be actually taken, specifically, for example, data protection impact assessments, using certain pseudonymization techniques, data protection by design and by default. But this is something that Athena will speak about more. So then maybe just to draw some main conclusions, I would say that first of all, yes, there are of course some data protection risks that are linked to AI solutions. But secondly, I think that this shouldn't deter organizations from leveraging on AI, specifically because AI is also used by cyber criminals, so there's a need to actually keep ahead of the game. And also at the end, cybersecurity solutions, if with AI or not, are also actually helping at the end data protection or to comply with data protection. So it's actually a good tool to make use of, or basically complying with data protection in the end. And then last but not least, there are of course also measures, specifically technical measures that can be taken to actually make sure that that the solutions are complying. And I think there Athena will speak more about this. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I will pass this one on to you, maybe. No?
Thank you very much, Carolin. And you're almost beat Dimitris for time, so but that means that the rest of you may have a minute or two extra, so it's not a competition, don't worry. The next speaker is Athena Bourka, and she is she's a network and information security expert at the European Agency for Network and Information Security. She is a specialist in the areas of data security, privacy, and trust, and she's also her organization's data protection officer. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Just to correct that ENISA is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. We changed our name very recently. I have been asked to contribute to this panel on the matter of how technology can reconcile artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and privacy. And now looking at my own slide here, I am thinking, and after having heard the previous speakers, that it's already a little bit problematic that we start this discussion with this term, reconciliation, for two elements that they should be, in principle, fully complementary to each other, because of course security is a very critical protection measure for privacy, but at the same time technology help. I think that as a first point, it is important to understand that we should not look at this as a tension. I mean, certainly there are challenges, but I think that instead of discussing cybersecurity versus privacy, artificial intelligence versus privacy, it is time to start discussing cybersecurity and artificial intelligence with and for privacy, and they have to see that all together. And I believe that in that sense, technology is and can be at least on our side. And here I would like to quote the father of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, who has said that we can't blame the technology when we make mistakes. So this is not only up to the technology, it's up to the way that we will use it. And this will take me to my first point here today, that it's time to use technology to face the challenges of technology. But in order to do that, we need to do it by design. We need to understand that privacy technology, privacy enhancing technologies should be part of artificial intelligence solutions. It cannot be just something that we add later on. It's not just an auxiliary thing. We will ask the lawyers, we will put organizational and technical measures, and that's it. We have to see that from the beginning. And I believe that this is a very fundamental principle, and we need to look at it from the very beginning of the whole discussion. Now, do we have all the tools that are available? Certainly not everything is in place, and because this is in any case an ongoing process and there's a lot of development to take place, I have listed here only some of the general, broader, let's say, categories of technologies that can be and should be explored in the area of AI and cybersecurity, like, for example, the use of techniques that could allow learning on encrypted data, pseudonymization and anonymization techniques was already mentioned just before, differential privacy solutions, also privacy preserving data mining and analytics, also transparency and control solutions, and there is a lot there, and a lot is not, so we need to work further on that, but it's not like we have not done research in this field. The research on privacy enhancing technology is not at all a new thing. So there is already starting point, and I would actually like to insist a little bit more on pseudonymization, which was already mentioned by Carolin, because I believe that it has great power also in the area of artificial intelligence, like, for example, in the context of machine learning. Why? Because it is not just about hiding the identities of individuals, but depending on the technology that it is used, it can also allow for unlinkability between different data sets, and it can also support data quality. And I believe that this is something that needs to be explored a lot to make it part of the solutions that we have in place. And here we have been working, by the way, on this topic at ENISA over the past years in cooperation with researchers and data protection authorities. And we have researched on different types of techniques that can be used, and I'm not going to detail this right now, but what I can say is that, of course, no matter what I say, this is not trivial. It's something that requires some effort, because there's not such a thing like one best possible technique and we use it in all cases. It has to be customized in the sense that we need to look in the overall context of the data processing every time, and also we need to look at other parameters, like, for example, utility, which is very, very important when you do analytics, for example, machine learning. This is fundamental for the research that Dimitris showed us before. It is important to allow to do something with the results. So that's why it's not one possible solution, but there is already, as I said, technology there, and it's important that this is part of the artificial intelligence solutions and of the projects that are relevant to this. I would like to say also that one step further, of course, this is all related to the concept of data protection by design, which we see in Article 25 of GDPR. But I would like to mention here that I think it's also of fundamental importance how we apply the default settings in all of these solutions, which again, we see it as a legal obligation in Article 25, but I think that it is important also when it comes to, for example, sharing data in the context of machine learning, for example, because default settings determine the way that the first usage will be, but they also determine probably the whole usage if the users do not know or do not want to change the settings. Now with this, just some final thoughts. Are we there yet? As I said before, clearly not. There's still way to go, but the good news is that we have something to start with. There is work already done. We have different technologies. We need to work more towards providing something like a repository of tools, of use cases, of examples. It doesn't need necessarily to be just the techniques, but the way that they have been used in particular cases. So as I said, examples, this is one of the topics that we want to progress more also at ENISA. And as I mentioned, of course, we need to weight protection and utility in all cases. And As a last and final point, I think that, of course, it's only a natural thought to envisage the broadening of the scope of this whole discussion to the more general area of ethics in artificial intelligence, and also discussed about ethical engineering on top of data protection and privacy engineering at the end. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Athena. Okay, so we're on to our final speaker. And once we get through Rosa's presentation, then we can go to the floor for questions. So now I present Rosa Barcelo. She is a partner at Squire, Patton, Boggs. She works in the Brussels office, and she is specialized in European data protection and privacy, and with a particular focus on ICT issues. If you wish, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you for the possibility to be here with the panel and all of you. I see many colleagues, former colleagues, and data protection experts, so it's a pleasure to be here. Now, first thing, I prepared the presentation, and today when I was coming, I thought, well, everything that is in the presentation, I would like to say it, but in a different order. And when I was riding the tram, I sort of wrote the order, which does not coincide. So I'm not going to show the presentation, I will just talk. But again, it's all there, but if I look at it, I am going to get all confused and messed up. So what I do in my current life is I am a lawyer, and meaning that I advise companies when they implement new processing operation, new processing systems. And essentially this means regulatory work. This means they come and you listen, you read what the project is about, and then you tell them you need to do this, you need to do the other, and you need the privacy policies. That's most of my work. So my contact with AI in cybersecurity comes particularly from this context. So because working as in this context, many companies would come and will say, we want to implement AI, and we are implementing AI to protect the security of our systems. So I thought that I will share with you really very, I would say, pragmatic and comments of my experience in this context. So it's very down-to-earth feelings. So first, the typical AI system that has come to my desk, there are many, but one that I chose for today is insider threat. I think that some, they have been discussed here by the colleagues. You have gone through, you have mentioned them, but so you have mentioned many of them, but I thought that I focus on this one because I thought that it was particularly interesting. So what is insider threat? Basically is the company needs to protect their own intellectual property, even personal data of their own employees, secrets, how they do business, customers, etc. So what do? They would deploy a system that aims to monitor what employees do, everything of what they would do online, network, combine it with offline information, a bunch. So it's a lot of information that is all crunched together. And then there will be some patterns that are being made of how is a normal behavior and what is a not normal behavior. And at some point, with some profiling and establishing profiles. And at some point, when somebody does something that does not conform to these patterns, maybe there is going to be an alert, and the alert is going to trigger an investigation. I mean, I'm sure it's much more complex, and a colleague can explain it, but essentially is that. So, yes.
Does it involve private information about these employees, what they do, for instance, on Facebook?
Not the cases I have seen. No, but it would involve things that maybe a priori you don't think. So, for example, you are an employee and you have gone on some business trip for your company, and so this information that you have submitted receipts, so that is all crunched in the same. And some categories of employees, just to complement this point, they will be more at a higher level of monitoring. For example, people who finish their contracts, so these people might be more prone to, for example, pass on, take information to another company, the next employee. So in this regard, you will see a special thing that they will do, that people will do, like send stuff to your own private email. Of course, these are sort of things that would trigger more the alarm. Certain amount of information, so when it reaches certain volume that you might be sending out, that too. So eventually, so that's the sort of system that I think nowadays are extremely common. So in face of this system, when this comes, some observations. So first one is the time when the company will come to you. I think that as the colleague, I forgot, Dimitris. When Dimitris said, I think that we have the feeling that this has, maybe some people would think, oh, this is very new, but I think it has gone for a long time, some of incremental changes. So I think that many companies have already implemented these systems, and when they come to you, is a moment where maybe the system is already in place, is working, or maybe but is already done. So we all know, and I think the principle of data protection, that everything has to be, usually you do it before, you do the privacy, you put in place the policies, you inform people, you do the DPIA before, not when it's done. But I think the reality of cases is all of that is usually done a posteriori. Now, second, something that comes to make it complex is that most companies don't have these systems in-house. They have to use providers. And so in the market, you see a bunch of providers who are experienced in doing this AI. And what the company will do is simply give them access to this information. And they are maybe controller, processor, this has to be the right contrast. So if you have to implement, you tell the company, well, I think that we need new contracts to make sure that the provider is limited on what they can do, and an Article 28 data processor agreement, all of that needs to be, sometimes you will face resistance because the provider they already have their contracts in place, so it has to be revisited, redone. So it's like, I would say, my second or related comment is that the fact that it's all done a posteriori, very often it does complicate a little bit things and the safeguards that you might need to implement. Now, as a normal lawyer, I think Carolin already mentioned, is that the first thing that you think about when you look at this processing is, of course, transparency and notification. So, and you sit there and you think, okay, did you notify the employees? Because it's all your employees' workforce, sometimes former employees, contractors. So did you notify them? And they probably will say, well, in the privacy policy that we gave to the employees when they start. And then you look at the privacy policy, you say, well, this privacy policy, maybe one can read all of this shebang happening in this privacy policy, but usually the privacy policy, it does not really, you don't seek to describe this in detail, nobody wants to describe, but you need to tell. So very often in my work, we will have to very, very often to enhance notification, either an ad hoc notification, either some training, either some recalling. And secondly, very often this triggers the need to work to the Works Council, and sometimes in some countries more than others. So this, if it hasn't been done, it has to be done. Now, again, thinking as a lawyer, the next one is, okay, what are the legal grounds? I mean, the legal grounds here, you think consent, it doesn't really work because that is in the employment context and it's just not feasible. So when you look at the legal grounds available, obviously legitimate interest is the only one that fits. Possibly, I mean, somebody was telling me, well, you could use this thing of a legal obligation because you have a legal obligation to secure the data, and when you do that, you secure the data of your own employees, and you could argue that there is a legal but I think is really stretching the limits of what is a legal obligation. But a legitimate interest is the obvious one, and the recitals of the GDPR point in the direction that security, enhancing the security is the right, is a legitimate interest work. So you have to go and do a legitimate interest assessment. And here is where you think, okay, what are the rights of the company? The right to protect their assets, the business secrets, and make sure that these are described and this is the right way to do, and there are no other ways less invasive. And then you look, okay, is it needed? There is a need, yes or not? And then is it balanced properly? So it's easy to say, but then when you have to put it in a piece of paper and making sure that there is a proper balance and the right safeguards. So, but in any ways, the legitimate interest is pretty much well, yeah.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Thank you for your intervention. My question is related to the nature of the data in this AI context. You can also gather special categories of data, and if you gather those data, the normal legal bases are not enough. You need also to mobilize Article 9 and the exception under Article 9.2. So this is first my remark, and for legitimate interest, I'm not quite sure that the balancing test will pass in this context. So, yeah, just a remark. So.
Yeah, no, it's extremely good point. This is I get to this now, but I will get to this to your point. I completely agree. Is really. Navigating to make, so, but I'll go back because there is now a point that in the next point that addresses a little bit that. So, because after you do the legitimate interest, what you do next is obviously an impact assessment, the data protection impact assessment, because indeed, when you look at the what happened here, normally it ticks the boxes of what is needed for impact assessment. There is profiling, there is monitoring, and so the EDP board said that when there is one or two, I mean, if there is the three categories of Article 35, you already do the impact assessment, but in other cases you have to do, so in this case, I think it seems obvious that is one of these cases where it calls for a data protection impact assessment, and this in this context where I think that because at the end, the impact assessment to me is a little bit an expanded legitimate interest assessment, more sophisticated. So when you do the impact assessment, I think you reach exactly what you say. So you need to make sure that there is the balance, and in order to be the balance, just to the points where I usually get to in order to make this balance more right are exactly these. Number one, for example, the types of data. Is there a way that we could do the same without using all the data, in particular sensitive data? So that's where I would come to tell the company, could we cut some sort of data that is the worst data and to still get to the solution that is intended? So totally yes, that's one, the sensitivity of the data. Another one is false positives. You see that very often this AI is very intelligent, but still it gets to false positives. So this system clicks that, yes, somebody is maybe engaged in some inside damaging, yet it was not true. The person maybe might have some for whatever reason. So can we train this system so that to reduce the false positives and minimize them so that there is the less damage for the individual? And this, I think, goes to the point that Athena made about having an oversight and a sort of learning process so that it is inbuilt in this system that is going to minimize privacy invasion. So the oversight and the company itself, I think, is very important that and as a measure to include in the privacy impact assessment as something to safeguard. Another one is, as I said before, is the transparency. We inevitably, in all the ones that we have done, we have recommended more transparency. Pseudonymization, or I don't know how to call it, but for example, the machine, when it triggers an alarm, not up until a certain point, everybody involved doesn't know who is the person who is engaged in the wrongdoing. So trying to keep this anonymity as long as possible. So until it's absolutely necessary. So at the lower level, the technicians might not need to know that this is Rosa Barcelo who might be allegedly to be doing that. This might be necessary only up to certain level and after certain people have given their consent when there is security, so that you push it back as much as possible. So I think, and I guess that also minimize. So in a company, to protect what the company will call our crown jewels, not everybody might have the access to the crown jewels or so would it be possible in certain cases to minimize the number of people who will be subject to all of that so that you get more minimization? So this is in general the sort of safeguard that you would build in a DPIA and that you would tell the company to implement. So again, I think this is what I thought I would say. These are my initial thoughts, and I'll be happy if there are questions to engage with you and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Rosa and all the speakers. So now we can move to the official. We've already had some questions, but now we can move to an official question period. And I would like to start with very general question to Dimitris. I liked your historical overview, and to someone who's not an expert in the technical development of AI, I find it very interesting. And what triggered my interest was there was an article in the BBC News website this past weekend, and they were invoking the concept of the AI winter. I didn't know this was a historical thing, but they suggested that there is another AI winter coming in the next decade. And that our expectations of what AI will be able to deliver are vastly overblown. Do you think this is true? Because I remember, for example, in the early 2000s, our expectations of what genetic technology could deliver have shown to be a bit unrealistic. Do you think the same may be true for AI?
Based on Thank you for the question. Based on what has happened in the last, from the start of AI blooming back in 50s until the first AI winter and then reappearing again, and how the modern technology, computational power, storage capacity, supercomputers, right now they are developing and they are researching in quantum computers that they are, let's say, very strong, and how the AI techniques have been developed. I believe that we might be say, optimistic in what will happen in the next 10 years, but I believe that we will meet a certain bloom and developments that they will be very, very in advance of humanity. But as all the speakers said, if we do not support and respect data protection and the human subject, then even if it's developed, it will raise certain issues, problems, and might not even be able to be used.
Thank you, Dimitris. And my last question is for Carolin. We both invoked the problem of sensitive data. Given the nature of IoT, big data and so forth, does it not seem likely that in the future any large big data set will have sensitive data in it because of the possibility to combine and deduce various sensitive conclusions, etc.? And will this not make AI without consent impossible?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really interesting question. Well, To start with, I don't think necessarily that every big data set would include necessarily sensitive data, because that obviously depends a lot on where the data comes from and what actually the data is used for. I think in the particular example of our case, where, for example, sensitive data might be included in the context of IoT devices. I'm also not sure if the sensitive data itself would be in the data set, but maybe it could be inferred. And I think that's more maybe the danger, that the data set itself might not include this type of sensitive information, but then if you combine it with other data sets, that there could definitely be the possibility to come up with sensitive data. So I think that's more the problem, and it demands, of course, the same level of protection as if it was included in the first place.
Okay. Questions from the floor, please? The gentleman with a waistcoat. Very fashionable.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Ala El-Momani. I'm from Ulm University in Germany. I actually have two questions, but I'll probably pass the second one in case nobody else. I would then ask later. Dimitris, you mentioned that the European Union is planning to spend 20 billion yearly on its research, investment, and development. And when we look at it from a high level, that is a huge number. But when you break it down to categories, cybersecurity, let's say it will get some, I don't know, millions maybe, a fraction of this 20 billion. And considering now that cybersecurity can be a defending algorithm or an attacking algorithm that can be used by criminal, for example, criminal groups or other countries which are not allies with the European Union, for example, or so, do you think this fraction of the number is enough? Maybe other criminal groups or other countries would spend even more for this research in cybersecurity? And if you have like any numbers from other countries just for the comparison purposes.
Thank you for your question, very nice question. To be honest, I don't have numbers. As far as I know, the United States might even spend more than Europe. But regarding the amount Europe is planning to spend for cybersecurity, depends on how they will use it and what they will, where they will research. The focus research will be. It depends. It will be enough or not. That's why they are planning each year to spend 20 billion, and I believe that based on the results of each year, they will shift the allocation based on the needs and the current trends. Maybe in the broader sense of cyber, if we also involved cyber crime and not only cybersecurity, because there are two different domains, the fund, I believe, will be much more significant because the way of tackling each issue is different while you are using the same techniques.
Yep. Lady with her hand raised.
I just wanted to follow up on what you said, Athena, talking about default settings and sort of particularly for users who maybe don't have the knowledge or the interest to do that extra level of work. I think a lot of what we've talked about has sort of been for those who are more familiar with cybersecurity or maybe are on the infrastructure side of Internet of Things, sort of how we can use that in an institutional sense. But where are the opportunities to maybe democratize or increase access to some of the opportunities afforded by AI and cybersecurity at sort of an individual or sort of household level?
I hope I got your question correctly. So, your question was about how we can use the defaults, let's say, as an element that can empower, let's say, users to make the right choice. Is that okay? This is a very, very long discussion, I think, in general, a very interesting one, because I think there is the critical question there is to how much extent can users pick their defaults, and to how much they know, especially when it comes to security, for example, privacy as well, of course, but to what extent can they really know all the functionality and what is the best, let's say, type of protection? This is one question. Then, of course, what is very, very important with the defaults is that they really determine the way that the system is used. So they have to be designed in a way that they are protective for the user, of course giving them the option. So for sure we need to have information about how these defaults can be changed. These things go together. But at the same time, I believe that an initial level of basic protection should be already included by default. And by the way, this is not what we see in practice. I mean, we have seen, for example, reports like, for example, from the Norwegian Consumer Council, which has showed exactly the opposite. They have showed that big companies, for example, have been using defaults in order to nudge users towards privacy invasive choices. So it is by design made in such a way that you will choose what you will feel that you have the choice, that you are asked to. You are presented with a policy and you made the choice, but then you don't know, however, that the way that this whole thing is designed is made in a way that will, at the end you will pick the non-privacy friendly choice. Why? Because it's better colored, it has nice letters and all this. So I think, yes, of course, users need to have a choice, and that's why they need to be presented with information. But again, this information should be simple, and the basic level of protection, in my opinion, should already be present by default, especially when we talk about this type of technologies, which are so complicated, and users cannot go into detail understanding all these things. They don't want to, they just want to use the service. I hope I covered.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. What I hear mostly is cybersecurity needs AI. So AI is used for the benefit of cybersecurity. That can be very useful indeed. My background is in cybersecurity. What I worry about is the other direction. So cybersecurity for AI. We all know that AI systems can be fooled very easily. And let's take the example of employee monitoring. When these AI systems are not really protected, it might become very easy to deliberately damage a colleague, or possibly internally, or from the outside, to damage a reputation of someone who's high up in a company by deliberately feeding false information into the system. My question is especially to Rosa and Athena, are you aware of these kind of issues? Does this get attention itself? Is it seen as a threat itself? And what's your reaction in general to this?
Well, I think this is, in my mind, very much relevant to the way that the algorithm is created, so the way actually that you learn that from the data. So, and it's very much related to the bias that is included in that.
How authentic is the input of the algorithm?
How authentic is the input? Okay, I think so maybe basically what you're asking for is actually not what is inside the system itself, is about how the quality of the data that you feed into the system. Okay, yes, I see the problem that you point. I actually do not think that it is particular only to artificial intelligence. You can see that in any types of analytics, actually, right? It's the same type of thing. I mean, how you preserve the quality of the data input. I'm afraid that this is a problem that can never be fully technically solved, because at the end people feed the system, and this is something that what we can try to do from a technical point of view, let's say, is to make sure that the systems that are being used to learn from this data are not biased, or they're based on let's say techniques that are privacy preserving. But the problem that you are referring to, at least if I understand correctly, I do not see how you can technically solve it. I don't know if maybe Rosa, would you like to add something?
No, I totally. I haven't come across the problem. I can see the problem very well, and when I think about how one should try to solve it, perhaps what you said, Athena, to improve how the algorithm, but also to make sure that no decisions are taken on the basis of partial information and perhaps to require the system to trigger any of the alerts, or on the basis of accumulation of material and not specific to one? As in other words, not to put everything on the basis of very small pieces of information.
I disagree that there are no technical solutions. They may not be perfect, but certainly things have to. You have to look at explainable AI. So if I get accused as an employee of misbehavior, I would like to certainly see the reasoning that's underlying this accusation. Another thing, if you want to protect input, the technical means for this is requiring digital signatures on the inputs that are given to the AI system, so that it is accountable from who the data comes and that the integrity of the data is guaranteed. Of course, that is an extra layer to the whole system, and I see you, no, this is not going to happen, but I mean, if you get into legal problems, really that a high-profile person in a company is accused of misbehavior on the basis of false information, I think you're in really big trouble. And this could be a serious blow to these kind of systems.
If I may just respond to that, of course there are technical measures, but again, they are not, I mean, even signatures that you mentioned, of course, they guarantee integrity, but they do not guarantee what the input was on the first side. So that's why I'm saying there's always a problem there. And I think what we could do maybe is to think of systems, I mean, not at the input level, but maybe at the implementation level of the system itself that can help against this type of problems. Like, for example, when Rosa explained the case of internal detection, I was thinking that perhaps one privacy-friendly technique is to do a layered approach. So once you have an incident, you first inform the person, you first make him or her aware that there is an issue. You don't automatically go to the investigation level. So this, of course, again, it's not solving the problem of quality per se at the input level, but it can at least support, let's say, this problem that you were referring to. So people being suddenly accused of something that they don't know. So we can envision this type of systems, and I fully agree with what you mentioned about explainability. And again, this is part of the implementation of the system again, and doesn't solve the quality element. That's in my point of view. But I think that we can never really solve this issue as long as the data are being inputted by persons, but natural persons. But we can try at least to minimize the effects, if I can put it like that.
Hi, so I have one question regarding privacy notices and how to strike the balance with the right amount of information which should be in there. If we go more in details explaining how all of these AI and different technologies are working, that will make privacy notices unreadable, at least for most of the people. And how can organization strike the right balance actually to provide enough information for the people to know what the organization is doing with their data, meaning customers and employees, but also should it be some kind of layered approach in terms of having a general privacy notice on your websites where you are explaining that you are using AI, different technologies, and then having a link or something where you are going to explain that in a bit more detail. I still haven't seen a proper privacy notice from an organization where they actually explain how the AI and different algorithms work. Even though most of the organization will rely on legitimate interest, whenever you actually ask them for a legitimate interest assessment or any kind of documentation where you can actually see more details about these technologies, you will never get them. So how can actually organization abide by GDPR and actually say that they have notified their notify the data subjects if they're not providing legitimate interest assessment, not providing a bit more detailed privacy notices, just saying that you're using AI, you're using different algorithms to protect your internal network or from cyber threats or so on, it's not enough. So how do you actually strike that balance? Thank you.
For me, I mean, that's basically the everyday job to help the companies to strike the balance. And again, I agree that some companies might have better privacy policies, others not. To me, more the layer notice is good, but I find that there are some easy concepts that can be explained very easily, and is like, you need to realize that everything you do at work is sort of possibly monitored. So, possibly. So, and this is not so difficult. You go to the internet, your emails, you access this and the other. So that's a message that maybe is important to convey.
Thank you. Just to add on top of that and give you a real example. I knew, of course, about my previous companies' policies around internal detection and protection of cyber threats and so on. And of course, when you read the information which they gave to the employees, it's about internal network, about the things which we employees do on our actually using a company assets, infrastructure, and so on. But then once I received a mail from a cybersecurity officer who told me that I have an unsafe Netflix password, which was, I have never used Netflix on my own or actually company asset or computer, which I received from the company. So I do believe that the companies do track a lot of these things, and the colleague mentioned in the beginning asking for Facebook and social networks and so on. I do think that the companies are doing much more than they need to. So if I'm using computer asset to watch porn sites, that's fine. Then they should, of course, have some kind of disciplinary measures against me. But if I'm watching Netflix and something else, and if they're scanning the whole internet environment to actually check my behavior, that's of course not right. And many companies are actually doing that, and they are going outside of the boundaries of what they can do and what they cannot do.
Maybe I can just add 2 points on this. So I think the first, what you mentioned, this example, I think for companies it also becomes increasingly challenging, because obviously the boundary between work and private life is becoming increasingly blurred, because more and more often companies allow employees to use their devices also for private use, and they're of course striking the right balance between where you actually start protecting your network and where does it end. I think that becomes a bit tricky. And then maybe just also to add a point on the information notice, I think the challenge here is, as you mentioned, to actually make it both comprehensive, so actually giving an overview of what information is held, but then also making it explainable, so to make really sure that the individual also understands. And I think there probably the right balance has to be maintained on how much information you actually give in this notice. I think where companies will have actually much more troubles if when it comes to the right of access to information, so with Article 15 of the GDPR, I think they're really like to give a comprehensive overview of what data is held and how it is used. I think that becomes actually more of a challenge than in the information notice itself.
I just wanted to ask another question on what was mentioned earlier, sort of bias in algorithms and sort of the ways that when we're talking about, particularly currently you talked about profiling and sort of how we build archetypes to look at what sort of prevention mechanisms. Obviously a lot of data sets, certainly if it's used in something like policing, maybe gear towards particular biases of minority groups or other groups of individuals. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, obviously part of this has to do with something like a layered approach where it's related to sort of internal other mechanisms or frameworks that are in place to sort of correct that bias. But not being in the field myself, I'm just curious, how are we trying to use some of the advantages by AI to readjust maybe a tendency to be a bit more biased in our data sets and the results that come out of that?
Thank you for the question. What I can say was discussed actually in another panel yesterday quite intensively, this topic, I think, and also what we heard also at that discussion is that of course the technology itself is not going to just solve the bias in the sense that it will just reproduce the bias, right? And it will even strengthen it. So there again, this is again a matter of input data, but there I would say that it depends a lot on what data you feed into the system and how you train then also the algorithms on the basis of, for example, I don't know, we have seen like, it's very often that people of a certain color get more often arrested, for example. This is, of course, something that can only be considered as a bias, and we can see that reflected also in AI systems as well, that, for example, for preventive police. Again, I am repeating things that I actually heard and learned yesterday from other panels. So I believe that for the question that you put here, I think that it's very important to look into the categories of data that we feed and the, let's say, types of connections that we make between data and conclusions. So as the predictive models that we have. And I believe there is a lot of room there to improve and to make them more neutral. I don't know if anybody would like to.
Down at the front, the lady on the front row has a question. And you have the pleasure of being the final question.
We've spoken a lot about AI systems that companies can use for employee monitoring. Wondering what other AI systems companies can use to mitigate cyber attacks, like network monitoring or anything like that. Do any of those tools come with risks for data protection and GDPR compliance? What are your thoughts on those? Or is employee monitoring really by far the riskiest AI tool that companies can use from a privacy perspective?
Would you like
to? Can I tell her just one that I think that to me didn't bring us many risks as an example? So to protect the company from external threats, not from internal, in particular phishing attacks. So the company often had systems so that train employees to report potential attacks. So the employee would send an email, oh, is this a spam, is this a phishing attack? And there is all sorts of, then the employees rated as a good one in identifying real phishing attacks or a bad one with a scoring number. In this case, so you are scored as a good one. So this sort of scoring, you think, well, it's never good to be scored, and you are not told, because if you are told, then maybe you might deter you from saying, oh, I have, maybe this is a phishing attack. So there is a certain reluctance to inform. So, but in this case, maybe is one that I think that in striking the balance between the protection, maybe is the effects of the individual being scored as a good or a bad detector, I think is not terrible for privacy in the scale of things.
If I may, I could give another example. For example, cyber threat intelligence. Let's forget employees and so on. There is, when you exchange incidents and instant analysis, there's IP addresses involved, there's email addresses involved, and of course all of this is personal data. And to me, it can be very invasive because, again, it's not about only what you get, it's about what you can infer, as Carolin said before. So this type of systems can be very invasive, in my opinion, and that's why you need to think in advance how protection mechanisms are incorporated.
Okay, that's about time. Thank you very much to our panelists. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you for your interesting answers. My final remarks would just be that, I mean, we all know this, but this discussion highlights the fact that it's important that cybersecurity develops in a legal and ethical way. Cybersecurity will develop, whether it be legal or ethical or not, and that's why it's of crucial importance that we have more projects like Cybertrust, where the legal and ethical aspect is at the center. And I hope that trend will continue in the future. And just as cybersecurity is important, lunch is also important. So on that note, I think we should finish. Thank you very much.